Excerpt from the official 724th Contact Report. Excerpt of October 11, 2019, translated with deepl.com. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation. Source:
FIGU Zeitzeichen
135 on page 1 to 19.
I also want to talk about this letter today from a man who searches our FIGU publications on the internet and therefore asks various questions. As you can see here, he has somehow and somewhere read, heard or otherwise somehow experienced various things, to which I am supposed to give answers in a bulletin, but not openly mention his name, which I will of course take into account in an answer, but to which I must explain that I do not want to answer all of the questions, but not all of them, and I am not allowed to explain some of them. What he asks about private things, namely why my ex-wife is slandering me, I don't really want to talk about that at all. Because for me the matter is closed, so I let others talk about it, who already clarified everything about 2 decades ago. On the one hand this was Michael Hesemann and on the other hand Guido Moosbrugger. Guido wrote something in 2007, but I didn't publish it because I wanted to let everything rest, but I think that I'll do that now anyway. But I will never go back to questions like these, even if I'm still being treated like this, whether by letter, phone, fax or internet. Basically, I really must not answer all his questions about what should be explained. And the reason I have to keep silent is because I promised your father Sfath already in the 1940s that I would keep silent about very specific things under all circumstances and therefore never talk about them in such a way and let things be said which on the one hand must not be allowed to go public, but on the other hand could cause a political catastrophe and another world war. And I cannot and will not be held responsible for that. Sfath only allowed me to secretly entrust certain information to a certain friend, whom he named by name and function, because he would carry out a task of clarification regarding my contacts with you Plejars. This information, together with exact predictions, which he then may also name openly after their arrival, are to serve him on the one hand as proof of my honesty and as proof of my contacts with you Plejars, but he is never allowed to betray the secret information and never talk about it with anyone. And that is what actually happened, which I never doubted from the very beginning. So to this day I have kept silent about all this certain and very serious information entrusted to me by your father, and I will continue to do so in the future and during the last period of my life. Furthermore, Sfath also explained that my silence did not only apply to all that he had entrusted to me and what we both saw together through real futures, because my promise of silence also applied to special information of an earthly military, secret service and political nature, which ascetic and later all of you, that is, your daughter Semjase, as well as you and Quetzal and others would give me. In any case, I may only speak openly and trumpet out into the world information that the people are already talking about speculatively anyway and that would remain so for the time being, although I must decide for myself how much I would say about this. So I may be able to answer 2 or 3 questions partially, but nothing more.
Maybe I can give some answers to some of the questions, if that is allowed. But please read out what questions the man has asked you.
That you can give answers is probably not possible, because the questions asked here in this letter you are not allowed to answer either, as you will hear soon. Lord. You can read his address here, and how and what he writes now. I will read it to you as it is written, if you want to hear it.
Questions to you personally, Billy Mia, original copy, without correction, DeepL translated.
Allow me to ask a few questions about what I'm seriously concerned about and what is behind it all. I have heard various stories from people, watched some programs on television and received all sorts of and also contradictory explanations from acquaintances and friends, but all of this does not satisfy me, which is why I am writing to you and hope that you can give me an answer to everything. That is why I will still be telephoning you, but I would like you to answer my questions in one of your bulletins, which you publish on the internet and which I always read with great interest. My questions are now the following, which I would like you to answer and explain to me what is behind it and what I have to think about it.
1. What do I have to understand and what is behind the object called TR3B?
2. What is behind the secret project, called Solar Warden or similar, in which the American President Donald Reagan is said to have had his fingers in the pie?
3. What has emerged from Reagan's secret project until today and does it still exist?
4. Do the Americans have a space weapons program and space weapons, and how do they do it if they do?
5. What really happened to your friend Wendell Stevens that got him sent to prison?
6. Why are you being slandered by your divorced wife, and why does she lie about making UFO models with drum covers and photographing them, and then claiming that they are real spaceships, when two experts, Rilsey and Christopher Lock-Hahn, checked everything and found that everything is true and that you are not a fraud? They also wrote the book about this
research of a real UFO
that I bought at the FIGU Association. And just as your divorced wife slanders you, so it is done by your younger son in another way, and I have been told that he was brought up against you by her for this purpose. And that must be true, because I have been to Schmadrudi and its center several times, inquired about you in the village and with its club members, because they do not go out in public and do not receive visitors. In the village and in the center as well as in other places I have received completely different statements and evaluations about you than your son and your divorcee lie on the internet. To be honest, after all that you have been described to me as a person, as a personality and according to your behavior, I would not only be pleased but also feel very honored if I could make your personal acquaintance.
7. What is true about all those many who call themselves contactors with extraterrestrials and tell stories that are more than just ridiculous and obviously only confused imaginations and fantasies, but which Michael Hesemann in one of his books lifts up into the sky and claims to be true? So it is really questionable whether this man still has all his senses together, because obviously this is not the case, because if he had even a small piece of knowledge of human nature and was not believing and naive, then he would not cheer up liars and deceivers as UFO contactors, who are only addicted to egotism and want to play up their sick ego with their ridiculous claims as alleged contactors with extraterrestrials and also want to satisfy their egotism. Also all the ridiculous assertions of the Hesemann are stupid and simple-minded, that these alleged contactors brought potatoes, soil samples, crystals and the noble side etc. from other worlds, which are of course chemical and biological etc. the same as the same things on Earth, because on all worlds these are the same as on our world. That he also puts you, Billy Mayer, in the same fraudulent bunch of contact persons, I find it quite impertinent and stupid, because since he has also written good articles about you and knows that the things you brought and which were also scientifically examined and analyzed very carefully, could not have come from our Earth, I find it outrageous and slanderous that Hesemann puts you in connection with fraudsters regarding alleged contact persons with extraterrestrials. This is particularly so because you, unlike the fraudsters, have been in contact with the fraudsters, which logically was not the case with the fraudsters, because no such contacts have taken place. You, Billy Mayer, have a demonstrable number of witnesses who are able to observe and witness many things during their contacts, which logically was not the case with the fraudsters, because they never had such contacts. Even today, These fraudsters had and still have no evidence whatsoever with clear photos, films or any other material that they could provide or could provide today. All these swindlers, liars and cheats can bring until today were ridiculous and stupid fantasy stories, things piled up on Earth, made fantasy drawings of alleged extraterrestrials as well as diffuse photos of made models which are not identifiable. This was already the case with Adamski, who with his self-built models, fake photos and with his lie stories of alleged contacts with people from Venus etc. cheated countless gullible people, although it was actually already clear at that time that Venus is a planet hostile to life and cannot have any higher life. But still today there are still many stupid Adamski's believers who believe and defend his lies and deceptions, as just stupid believers do, who do not think for themselves and are therefore also unable to distinguish between truth and lie, as it is also the case with the believers who as the bondsmen follow a dear God in heaven.
8. What about the 3 films Fleur 1, Gimbal and Go Fast?
9. Do the Americans have a secret government, also called shadow government?
10. There was a man in America named James Forrestal who knew something about UFOs but then killed himself, but why don't I know, so I want to know why.
11. What is true about the Roswell UFO case?
12. Why do so many stupid people still believe in the lie stories of Adamski and other cheats and swindlers today?
13. What is the Pentagon's secret program?
14. Why, Billy Meyer, are you keeping your distance from the public?
15. What's the Blue Book really about?
16. What about those people who are said to have been abducted by aliens, and what about the Gyzo intelligences, Astasharan, Men in Black, and underwater UFO stations, and what about countless UFO sightings and UFO interferences in the last World War by Foo Fighters, as well as in the Korean War and Vietnam War etc.?
You see, Pat these are the 16 questions that Lord has written here in this letter, but I can only answer some of them, which refer to things that do not have to be kept secret.
Various questions really must not be answered, as I know from my father's annals, because they fall under your duty of confidentiality, as he ordered. But I can answer other questions as well, if you want. As for the question concerning the slander against you, it must be and is certainly inevitable that you explain something about it even after such a long time, and I think it would be good if you let other people say something about it. I am interested in it, so I will read it then. But first I want to come to the point that I am very surprised how much more you know in connection with the freedoms on Earth and also elsewhere than I and all of us Plejars have known so far. This is evident from other annals of my father, which we have found in the meantime in his legacy, which has been closed to us until now, and whose closure opened independently after your last appearance with us, which we cannot explain, but by opening the lock we now got to new and extremely amazing information, and now we know that after my father's departure we neglected various things which would have been important to do, because we did not know what task he really had to do. How extensive this and his whole knowledge was regarding various things which he also taught you, and the main neglect, which affects us Plejars as a planet-wide population as a whole, included our lack of efforts in relation to more intensive learning, following and keeping to the
teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life.
It was only through your efforts, by reminding us of the teaching in an understandable way, that we were awakened again and actively encouraged to learn and follow all the necessary values, which were slowly and in the course of time followed more and more carelessly, without energy, indifferently and apathetically. However, through your efforts, through your tireless work in the new version of the teaching, which we spread and taught in all our peoples, everything changed very quickly, so that in only about 45 years a state was reached which again corresponds to that when the teaching was in full bloom. Apart from all the positive things that have resulted from the efforts of your new doctrinal constitution among all our peoples, our knowledge will now also be expanded in many respects by opening the secret legacy of my father, because all the knowledge we have gained through the secret annals of my father in the last few weeks already gives us extremely important insights, for example, regarding the existence of the many strangers who have been working on Earth since time immemorial, about which you also have much better knowledge than we do. This is precisely because my father's faith also taught you about this, but you not only had to keep quiet about it in front of us, but in this way the Earth people were also involved and have to remain so. But for this purpose you are commissioned by him according to his records to initiate us into this knowledge when the time for it is to be ripe, but this is to be determined by you.
Yes, I know, and this time refers to the fact that I'm supposed to explain to you and to you all that Sfath, as a complete confidant of mine, has asked me to share with you to maintain your peaceableness. And the time is supposed to be when you return to complete adherence to the teaching. And that has actually happened.
Then may I perhaps also ask now, as it is laid down in my father's annals, that you will enlighten us to what extent for us Plejars our security with regard to our peace and our personal peaceableness and all related behaviors would be endangered if we were to make ourselves recognizable to the strangers who have always been on Earth and not necessarily of a peaceful and humane nature?
There's nothing wrong with that, and besides it's my duty as instructed by Sfath to do it at the right time, which is now. I must, however, go into this in some detail and also include the 16th question from Mr. ... with regard to the Jayazu intelligences and Ashtashran, because they behaved in the same way as you did towards the strangers here on Earth, namely in such a way that they kept away from the strangers and did everything possible to ensure that they could never grasp even one iota of their presence. Ashtashran, if I talk about him first, was a criminal, I would even say a criminal, who then lost his life in the dull universe and whose real name was Ashtashran, but I don't know what that means. Ashtashran, like the Jayazu intelligences, belonged to the old splinter group of the old Plejarians, who had already settled in our Dern universe more than 22 million years ago and were at work in it. In particular, the Jayazu intelligences were in some respects malicious elements in this respect, while Ashkabran was also evil in other ways and, moreover, spread an impulse-driven mad delusion about his person among the Earthlings. Well, just as you Plejars of today are careful and keep secrecy towards the strangers on Earth, so also these two groups were anxious not to make themselves noticeable towards the strangers, which they succeeded in doing comprehensively and without any problems also throughout all times, following that the strangers still today do not know about their former existence, as well as not about yours. And the clue of the two groups, the Ashtashran and the Jayazu intelligences, was that they were in our presence only when they caused mischief, while they were located in another space-time plane and came only temporarily and unnoticed by the strangers into our presence. So that is one thing, while on the other hand your Plejaric existence still has to be addressed, for which there is much to be explained. First of all, as far as I know, the strangers on Earth have never been able to establish the existence of the Jayazu intelligences themselves, but have at most heard of them and consequently even assumed, because they themselves could not perceive them, because the Jayazu people, according to their old Plejaric technique, were able to shield themselves from any localization etc. As you Plejars are used to do also today, that the speeches would only correspond to suppositions or a fib. And as far as Ashtashran alias Ashtashran is concerned, to my knowledge he was never in our presence anyway, but worked from another space-time level on his confused believers on Earth. Now as for you, the Plejars, with regard to a possible danger to you, your peace and tranquility, etc. I can only say what your father Sfath has explained to me and suggested that you pass on to others. His explanations were that the Plejarian ancestors several million years ago were already much more advanced in terms of technology and development, and that they pushed these techniques even further than the various strangers on Earth. So this means that you Plejars are very far and far superior to all the strangers in terms of your technical achievements, as we Earthlings say. This means that even if the strangers have a highly developed technique that seems extremely futuristic to Earthlings, they can still fall far short of your Plejarian technique and cause you no harm whatsoever if you continue to behave as you have done up to now. If you hold back from them, if you do not let them recognize you, and if you do not let them locate you. This in the same way as the Geysers did, whose existence the strangers never became aware of. Further, it has to be explained that you Plejars in your Ankar universe in the Saran dimension will remain absolutely safe from the strangers on Earth, if you continue to follow your directives, which prescribe you not to take up any contact with foreign peoples and inhabitants of other planets etc. Thereby, and you know this very well, dear friend, as all Plejars know, you also protect yourselves from falling back into the old barbaric behavior, as it was still prevalent with you more than 52,000 years ago and was marked by strife and war. And it should also be mentioned that if the strangers operating on Earth were to be able to invade other universes of our creation, they would first have to find out which of the 6 other universes outside of ours it is in which their Plejar exists. And if they were to find that out, then the even bigger problem would be to find that dimension or space-time structure in the Saran dimension that is shifted by a fraction of a second to our Dern dimension space-time structure. But this corresponds to a myriad of possibilities as well as the myriad of possibilities to find the dimensional gate, which you use each time and you to beam back and forth between error and Earth. That, dear friend, is probably enough initial information for now, which Sfath has instructed me to give you at the right time. And here I think that these informations given by him should be the only ones that should be openly mentioned in reports of discussions. So I estimate in each case what your father has ordered me to pass on to you, because everything else is only meant for you Plejars, but not for others. Therefore also not for men.
Thank you, Edward, dear friend. What you have explained is enough for today, and I must first think about it thoroughly before I can deal with it further. Then I'd like to read what you wrote in response to the questions of ...
Well, sit down here on my chair, then you have the screen right in front of you and you can read better.
Readers' questions and answers.
Unfortunately, Mr. I am not allowed to answer all your questions, but I will comment on all those which I am allowed to address and explain. Your questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 9, 12 and 14 are covered by my professional secrecy.
5. What really happened with your friend Wendell Stevens, etc.?
Answer: Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens, USAF. Ret. was not only a very good, honorable, honest and worthy friend, but also a venerable and extremely trustworthy person on whose word and promise I could rely 100%, but exactly this was his downfall, namely because he was really trustworthy and kept his word of a given promise, namely with regard to information which I was allowed to give him in the confidence of absolute silence and secrecy, as I had already been instructed to do in the 1940s by the Plejars Sfath. At that time I didn't know Wendell Stevens yet, but I first learned that he would get in contact with me one day in the future, which actually happened. What brought Wendell Stevens into malicious discredit was the fact that my information made him a keeper of secrets, who steadfastly refused to divulge this information to anyone who would force him to talk. His steadfastness of silence, however, brought him harm and disaster, but this did not prevent him from keeping his promise of silence. So he accepted that, as a result of keeping his promise and silence, he had to suffer injustice by filthy lies and maliciously controlled slander of those authorities who wanted to force him to speak and betray his given promise. I guess that's all there is to it.
6. Why are you slandered by your divorced wife, etc.?
Answer: I will not comment on this, because for me these things of the past are closed and forgotten, so I will allow myself to let two other people have their say, who had a very good insight into everything and who have written and partly also published some things themselves, in order to clarify what was effectively a fact. What must be mentioned, however, is that stupid people, without any understanding or reason, usually journalists, who considered themselves enemies and other antagonists of me, and who thought they were great and superior to me, as many still do today, insulted me with dirty articles of lies and slander, which led to malicious attacks on me, even in the presence of FIGU members. The American Calque Corf, for example, was responsible for various articles of lies and slander, as was the chief editor and publisher of the magazine
Mysteries,
but also the writer
HWP
of the Jaffa equals journal for UFO Forschung, while KKK from the USA invented lies and slander itself and spread them worldwide. The editor-in-chief and publisher L.B. of the magazine
Mysteries
and the scribbler
HWP
of the Jaffa ran an unparalleled smudging journalism based on malicious lies and slander. There is nothing more to say from my side, which is why I only want to list a few statements by Michael Hesemann, which he wrote to Professor Jim Deerdorf as editor-in-chief of the magazine 2000+, and which probably say much more than I would have to justify myself.
Editor-in-Chief of Magazine 2000+, Germany by Michael Hesemann, Germany. 2. Jim Deerdorf.
In the course of our investigation, which included 4 visits to Switzerland from my side and 2 from Jaime's side, we were able to interview 24 eyewitnesses, 21 of them FIGU members, 2 northern inhabitants of the village of Schmadruti, and a UN diplomat. Film Billy's collection of pictures and films as well as metal samples, and measure 4 of his contact or picture-taking sites. In analyzing his 8mm films, we were able to locate a first-generation copy from 1976 and first-generation prints of his images, far better material than any critics have ever dealt with. In the years before, I visited Billy's home half a dozen times and had 2 very intense conversations with Callie Meyer, Billy's ex-wife, one in 1988, the other in 1990, when she testified as a witness to Billy's contacts and confirmed in an affidavit, 1991, that she herself was a witness to Billy's contacts and that she never found any evidence to suggest that Billy was manipulating or falsifying any evidence. So let me ask you this, was she lying then, or is she lying now? Or are we merely confronted with a war of the roses? Is Kvyat's journalism as serious as that of someone trying to find out the truth about Woody Allen by simply interviewing Mia Farrow? It is a documented and testified fact that Kvyat contacted Billy in March 1998 and promised him a fair presentation of his case. In fact, he told Billy that he believed in his case and for years tried to present it to the American audience in an open, positive way. He told me the same thing. For this reason, Billy gave him permission to use his film. Bob Kvyat lied to us and abused our trust in the worst possible way. His Fox swindle is far from a fair journalistic treatment of the case, but nothing more than a public conviction without the slightest possibility of defense. On the other hand, he merely proved how unscrupulous and manipulative Hollywood producers can be when they smell quick money.
1. Poppies equals calliope. Garbage can lid. Garbage is sheer nonsense. Yes, there is a distant resemblance between these trash can lids and part of the
cake ship.
But what does this tell us about a case that was concluded in its photo phase as early as 1976, after half a dozen UFO types were photographed in authentic surroundings, objects of which we have comparative snapshots of identical aircraft from different countries? I admit that the cake ships were taken up at a rather difficult stage after Semjase's contacts had ended and just before Billy, after the stress of various attacks, suffered a breakdown from which he is still recovering. Therefore, there is a possibility that these images, like others, served the purpose of contaminating the case. On the other hand, we have carefully checked the pictures and the film of the aircraft. The trash can lids are made of plastic, the ship of highly reflective metal. The ship was filmed as it floated in front of a tall tree. We compared it with various miniature trees and the large Swiss weather pines and found that its structure was similar to a large weather pine, with the colors of the tree being reflected by its smooth surface. When Billy zooms in and out of the scene in the original film, you can clearly see the meadow he is standing on, the distance of well over 100 meters between him, the tree and the flying machine. And you can see that the object is far away and not in the foreground or even close to the camera lens.
2. Anyone who has ever met Billy Meier in person can confirm that his personality is neither that of a cult leader, nor that his position in the FIGU is that of an authoritarian leader. KKK never met Billy, so he can't say anything about him. The structure of the FIGU is purely democratic. Each individual agenda item is voted on. A sect has a neutral ideology, faith, and you will find salvation. Billy teaches, do not believe, find out the truth yourself. In his philosophy, man can evolve only through self-knowledge. He does not appear in public. He does not want to become a public person, because he does not want people to follow him or to see him as something special. Instead, he wants people to learn and find the truth for themselves, because that is the only way they can grow and evolve. What is therefore claimed to the contrary is equivalent to lies and slander, no matter who puts them forward. Michael Hesemann, Editor-in-Chief of Magazine 2000+, Germany.
Further published statements by Michael Hesemann. I went there again at the end of 1988. Then, as I said, I received the counter-statements from Jim D. and Company in 1990 and finally decided to publish Guido's book so that he could present the case from his point of view, the newly received material, from which Gary Kinder also made a book, Light Years, I processed in secret UFO. Due to the many attacks and criticisms, I also decided in the mid-1990s to reopen the Meier case, i.e., to conduct a thorough new, unprejudiced investigation. Together with Jaime Mawson, I interviewed about 40 eyewitnesses. Billy himself, of course, followed up the witness reports from India, obtained expert opinions, and documented everything on video. My report was published in Magazine 2000 at that time. It is available to you. I haven't changed my mind since then, nor have I come across any facts that would lead to a revision of my opinion. Billy has real contacts. There are dozens of eyewitnesses to this. He has taken some of the best UFO photos and films in the world. Even though his material was manipulated and contaminated from the outside, as I wrote in Secret UFO, Billy doesn't make a secret of that himself. What I wrote and believed sometime in the early 1980s, as a teenager, is no longer relevant to me today. At that time I was not even professionally qualified to try a case, because I was just a student. My mistake at that time, and many people in UFO research have made the same mistake, was to believe the Korf report. Today we all know that Korf is a fibber. Who wants to convince himself of it, has a lot to laugh at. www.callkorf.com http://www.callkorf.com. He now calls himself a colonel of a private Israeli special secret service and now claims to be a Jew, after he had claimed in an interview a few years ago that he was an evangelical Christian, had found the true route of the Exodus and now wants to investigate the Shroud of Turin. On his website he uses photos of Czech models, from whom he has been interviewed, although it is striking that all these models imitate his language style. Of course no one in the fashion world knows the Czech supermodel, the second most beautiful woman in Europe, a Martina Tykova, who is supposedly his assistant. The fact that my investigation, which I conducted in the 1990s, came to a different, positive, result than I would have believed in the 1980s only shows that I was really prepared to approach the matter openly and, if the facts demand it, to reconsider my opinion. When Werner Walter claims that commercial interests have guided me, it is simply ridiculous. I never marketed the case, not even finished the video, although the cost of my investigation, due to the high travel costs, was much higher than anything ever raised by the sale of Guido's book, and the pre-financing by FIGU was only used to cover the travel costs for Phobal and Company to India. Of course I am still being attacked by Walter and Company because of this. But I don't care about that either. For me only the truth counts, simply and alone. A very warm greeting to you and all the other FIGUans. Your Michael Hesemann. Addendum by Guido Moosbrugger. Saturday, September 16, 2006.
With regard to the statement of Michael Hesemann, which he wrote to Jim Dierdorf years ago, I would like to say that everything that is claimed to be contrary to what Hesemann explains is nothing but mean and particularly malicious lies and slander, no matter who is bringing them up. This refers specifically to all the lies that Billy is accused of hating, as I have experienced myself since I met him in Hinwil in 1972, and since then he has been terrorized to hinder his activities and mission by having his pictures stolen and falsified by a man who lived in the canton of Ticino, as well as by a man from the Swiss Rhine Valley, in order to harm Billy. This kind of evil doing has been maintained every year to this day, even after the move to the Center Hintisch Madruti. Secretly, evil cabals were not shy away from it, and even today, outrageous lies about Billy are still being spread to bring him into a bad reputation through blasphemous slander all over the world. This is done especially through newspapers, television, magazines and journalists who are stupid enough to believe outrageous lies, like among others an apparently not very intelligent H.W. Painter, who publishes blasphemous interviews in Jewfoff magazines, which are peppered with true-lie arias of Billy's ex, like the following, which is nothing else but outrageous lies and slander. And I have to say that I cannot understand how a woman can lie and slander so impudently and unscrupulously, whose husband did everything for her so that she would be well, which I can testify to, as well as Bernadette, Jacobus, Ingelbert, Maria, Madeline, and all the others, which we altogether appreciate Billy and his whole kind of friendship and humanity as much as in his readiness to help, his kindness and his dedication to his work, which he has done with hard manual work and also by writing books throughout the years, during all weekdays and often up to 18 or more hours per day, without the addition of his own financial means and his knowledge of various craftsmanship, which he carried out himself, starting with carpentry and joinery work, the entire house electrics, bricklaying, concrete and slab work, snow removal with the tractor, gardening, farming, forest and digging work, which he carried out by himself and with only one arm with pitchfork, pickaxe and shovel etc., and together with our members, our center would never have come into existence.
Smear article, original reproduction, without correction, including errors, by Hans Werner Paniger, April 14, 2006. Commons disabled for interview with Caleb Meyer. Renewed doubts about Billy Meyer. About the Jaffoff interview with Caleb Meyer. Renewed doubts about Billy Meyer, by Hans Werner Paniger. In an interview with Billy Meyer's wife Caleb, you all know the Swiss contact person Edward
Billy
Meyer, who claims to be in contact with extraterrestrial intelligences, whose origin lies in the area of the Plejars. Seven Sisters. To confirm this, he submitted hundreds of UFO photos over the years that show Pleiadian spaceships. In the past, we have raised the case several times. There is a detailed review of the book Guido Moosbrugger, Unseefliegen Doc. Guido Moosbrugger, and They Do Fly. In which I once again presented our skeptical attitude towards Meyer's fantastic claims.
skeptical attitude
Is actually an understatement. In our opinion, which is shared by all serious researchers, Meyer's contacts are deliberate
inventions.
The UFO photos are fakes, and the core group that lives permanently around Meyer is a sect-like community, while in the German-speaking world only a few good believers are taken in by Meyer's claims. Meyer's stories find widespread circulation in Japan and the USA. Numerous forgeries have already been proven to Meyer, and his credibility is at the lowest end of the possible scale. It is therefore all the more incomprehensible when Magazine 2000 editor-in-chief Michael Hesemann considers Billy Meyer to be
one of the most fascinating people of our days.
But maybe he means one of the most cunning people of our days, who can live quite well from the money of his patrons. And when Mr. Hesemann then also writes that
some photos were found that appeared rather dubious,
and tries to justify this with a contamination by Meyer's opponents, by the extraterrestrials or by Meyer himself, in order to protect himself and his family. Preface to Meyer's book The Truth About the Pleiades, Newed, 1996, then a quite proper portion of naivety belongs to it. While one cannot perhaps expect publishers who predominantly publish esoteric literature and who are also opening up the stage to the gullible public again for Meyer by publishing his new book, to be able to analyze critical contexts, one should expect the same from Germany's UFO experts, according to foreign countries, and connoisseurs of the subject matter. Here, Hesemann must finally take a clear position and not help those who are undecided over the threshold to sectarianism by apparently confirming statements. A new development in the Meyer case is looming on the horizon, which Michael Hesemann cannot escape if he does not want to become Meyer's pioneer himself. It is hardly known that Meyer's wife has meanwhile separated from her husband and is living in divorce. For the first time she broke her silence towards her Swiss colleague Luke Bergen, who spoke with Mrs. Meyer and had the interview published in the UFO Courier. From this we can already deduce that, according to Mrs. Meyer, his contact experiences were all lies and deception. For example, there was an explanation for the photograph of an alien with a ray gunner for Meyer's
cake ship
photo, for which he had apparently used a simple barrel lid. Since Mrs. Meyer now obviously opened up to critical UFO researchers, I, in the following called HWP, also took the opportunity to have a half-hour conversation with Mrs. Caleb Meyer, KM. At the beginning of May, even if some things could not be discussed in as much detail or have become clear as might have been necessary. Mrs. Meyer gives us a small insight into her husband's life and work.
How did the divorce actually come about, and did you have a permanent job on your husband's farm?
I haven't been to the farm since 1994. Last year in June, I quit. That is quite clear.
Note this part of the sentence is deleted because it defamatory violates the privacy of another person and maliciously damages their reputation.
My permanent task was of course the whole household. I cooked for the crew, with children about 16 people, and received visitors. I also looked after the library and processed the mail of the about 100 to 120 passive members.
Your husband is accused of more or less creating and leading a sectarian community. How do you view this accusation?
In order to be able to say something about this, you have to work on the farm yourself for a long time, be able to talk, discuss, observe the whole thing and then come to the conclusion whether this is a sectarian community or not. But it looks like this. There are many paragraphs and laws within the group. You can't smoke, you can't do this and that, you can't go outside, you can't do that and, one law after another. Criticism is neither tolerated nor expressed.
Is this core group living on your husband's farm actually a blindly following group?
In a certain sense, yes. People have to believe this, otherwise they would not have decided to live on the farm. If my husband says it's so, it's so. There's no criticism. If now my husband says that my wife stole this and that, then that is so, there is no discussion, all people have to believe that, there is no criticism. You don't believe this, if you don't keep to it, you are suddenly an outsider.
Does your husband deal with the group in an authoritarian way?
If he agrees with something, then the group also agrees with it. You can't say no. It is quite authoritarian, dictatorial and hierarchical.
Now you had made many friends within the core group over the last few years. How did they react to your husband's accusations that you stole certain things? Did they stand behind you or did they drop them immediately?
The group members were all my friends. Because of these false accusations that my husband is making against me, everyone is now against me. I have indeed been dropped. It's sad because the truth is not as he describes it. People need to listen to me too, what I have experienced. The group members did not know a lot of things. I have covered my husband, so to speak. If the group members were not on the farm, for example, because they were working during the day, they would not have experienced everything as I did. They don't know about a lot of things. It's the kind of stuff I don't even want to bring out. It's not in my character. It is also far from my mind to finish my husband as he says, because there were also beautiful moments and times, which I do not want to dirty with dirt.
Your husband is accused by the serious UFO research of falsifying photos and the like.
It is really tragic and mean what my husband does. I can tell you that these are really all fakes my husband made. To prove this, you only need to compare and look at the photos and material over time.
HWP, have you ever seen your husband fake photos?
You can't see how he produces the photos. I only saw something here once, as a model. That's all. However, I was a bit surprised when my husband published a contact report last year, in which he showed his last photos. They only showed a lid. And the nasty thing about it is that Guido Moosbrugger even lectures in America with these photos. Surely something must be done about that.
Did your husband even have the opportunity to fake the photos without being noticed?
Sure, he is a free man. He went and came as he pleased. He didn't ask or think I had a family or I had kids. And the group members did not see these things. My husband was away for days, nights, away from home. We didn't know where he had gone. Days or weeks later he presented us with new photos or similar. After his return there was always something there.
In view of the fact that the photos are only fakes, what do you think about the photo analyses of the American scientists?
I have the feeling that there are basically a lot of cheaters in America. If I now speak of what Mr. Korf said in his book, Spaceships of the Plejars, the Billy Meyer story. Prometheus, Bulletin, 1995, Review in Sfath number 110, 2'97:61, then what my husband always said about these scientists cannot be true.
What do you know about the metal samples that were allegedly examined?
In the meantime, I have read through various chemistry books and I think that these metals are composed of different chemicals, alloys. I don't think they're alien metals.
You are currently being vehemently attacked by your husband in contact reports or on the internet via http www.alien.figu.figuhp50. HTM. What exactly does he accuse you of?
Mainly that I have stolen a lot of things, or that I have been to Hinterschmidt before, that I have influenced the passive members in some way, etc. All those things that are all wrong.
What does your husband actually think about his group members? Are they just fools who finance a nice life for him?
Yeah, sure. Besides, he lives for free up there on the farm. Any man would be lucky to have had a life like that. Each member must give up a certain part of his or her income. After all, everything has to be financed, the mortgages, electricity, etc. He can't carry that himself.
Does your husband actually believe in his contacts with the Plejars himself?
Yes, he already believes in it himself. He's convinced that this is so. And to prove these contacts, he falsifies the photos. Also so that he can tell the people of the core group again and again, look here, it has been like this and like that. He needs people, he can't stand on his own feet by himself. He does not want to get out of his psychic labyrinth, because if he wanted to get out of there, he'd have to live very poorly afterwards. The real contact people, they don't go among people or to the masses, they stay hidden like that, for a lifetime. And those who only want to make money, they go out, they must have people like my husband. He must have people to lift him up to heaven.
What happens now?
My husband continues as before. I am currently very satisfied and I have realized what I have been wishing for years, namely to enter the nursing profession. It is very nice to see how satisfied people are when you help them a little bit. I attach great importance to the human and not to this power, honestly. So it was always a torture for me that people were deceived by my husband and that I covered for him.
Thank you for the information and I wish you all the best for your new phase of life.
Late statement by Bernadette Brandy, Switzerland.
Only now, November 8, 2019, have I learned in the interview that Hans Werner Peiniger conducted with Calliope Meyer in April 2006 and which he, like many other people who are talking to her for the first time, fell for. This was also the case with many core group members who initially reacted very positively to Calliope Meyer. Naturally also because she was the wife of Billy, who for his part is extremely honest and open, but then, after getting to know her better, they discovered to their deep regret how scamming, mendacious and power-hungry the ex-wife of Billy Edward Albert Meyer really is. Not a single word of her entire interview with Mr. Peiniger is true. And Mr. Peiniger, unfortunately, in his bias against Billy Meyer, was unable to see through the scamming maneuvers and the deep lying of his interview partner, who in her malice and proverbial jealousy was only too happy to provide him with ammunition against Billy. For in addition to all their other negative character traits there is also a deep-seated desire for revenge and prestige, which leads them to twist the facts in their favor and always put themselves in the best light and pass the buck to others. As an example, I take her statement.
I also looked after the library. FIGU did not have a library at that time, and handled the mail of about 100 to 120 passive members.
In this respect, it should only be mentioned that FIGU did not yet have a library at that time, and that Calliope's command of the German language was extremely limited at that time, not to mention her knowledge of the written language, which would have enabled her to process the extensive correspondence. Billy usually only spoke Greek with her. It was absolutely impossible for her to put any text down on paper without mistakes, and understandably, because for all her texts she needed a ghostwriter who was willing to sit down with her and write down her spoken words in an understandable way. How could she have handled the mail with these conditions? Another lie is that you are not allowed to smoke in the center. Billy was a heavy smoker himself, and that you are not allowed to get out, etc. I myself met Billy during 1976 and moved to the center in January 1978, where I still live today, 2019, so I can definitely say that I know Calliope and the conditions in the center and around Billy very well. The fact that smoking is forbidden is laughable for all those members who still like to reach for a cigarette. Billy was a heavy smoker himself, and the fact that one was allegedly not allowed to get out is just as ridiculous, because all core group members, whether they live in the center or elsewhere, lead their own private lives and personal friendships, about which they are not accountable to anyone, because FIGU is organized as an association and not as a sect that blindly follows its guru. Billy is also nothing more than a member of the club with the same vote as everyone else, and it is not that he should not be contradicted, because this happens quite often. Calliope's answer to the question of whether Billy had the opportunity to fake the photos is absurd, for hardly any other man was so meticulously monitored and suspiciously eyed by his wife as Billy of Calliope. In her jealousy, she always let herself be carried away to construct an affair out of almost every conversation he had with another woman, especially if it once lasted a bit longer, and therefore sometimes made scenes for weeks. From this premise alone, it would have been impossible for him to leave the center for any length of time in order to fake pictures or film recordings, for which he would have needed an outside studio or laboratory at the time, which would certainly not have gone unnoticed, quite apart from the fact that, on the one hand, he could not have afforded the necessary equipment for such forgeries financially, and, on the other hand, the technical possibilities for such forgeries were not even available at the time, which Mr. Plejars for his part should actually have known if he had dealt with the matter in a truly unbiased and objective manner and had acquired the necessary expertise. In contrast, however, MUFON has done so and has judged Billy's pictures to be genuine for several years. The fact that Calliope claims to have read and understood various chemistry books and, if she has actually done so, attributes to herself the necessary specialist knowledge required for the assessment of metal samples only shows the extent to which she overestimates herself and how great her craving for recognition is, with which she even defies the judgment of such a luminary as Drive, Marcel Vogel. All other statements made by Calliope are not to be taken seriously either and represent the exact opposite of what is reality and facts. However, all those who know Calliope personally are clearly aware of her extremely ambivalent relationship to given facts, for often enough she herself has made it clear in what fantasy world she lives. There are no idiots, as Mr. Plejars and Calliope like to portray it in a slanderous way, in the Center and the FIGU Association, but rather well-educated, independent, self-reliant and able-bodied people who put their husbands or wives in every situation and who do not think that they themselves should be considered something better, as is the case with Calliope, who even before her divorce from Billy tried to push herself to the fore at the expense of the truth, but that she cowardly conceals the fact that she herself is not seeing an alien, namely Patha, and that she could see the Plejarian ships several times even in daylight, apart from the fact that she also had other experiences that should have made her think if she were honest. This fits her very well and her lying, scamming and malicious defamatory behavior.
7. What is true about all the very many claims made by people, etc.?
Answer. In response to your question and to what you have said, I would first like to say something in relation to Michael Hesemann, because I think it is necessary for me to explain something about him. First, Michael Hesemann is not the man you think he is. It is true that he has obviously turned away from the matter of UFOs etc. and, as it seems and is to be assumed, whereby it remains an assumption until clarity arises, he has turned to the faith in the Catholicism, because on the one hand he has not let me hear anything more about him for years, and on the other hand it turns out when information about him is broadcast on television that he has found a field of activity in the Christian faith and the Vatican. But this is only a supposition and, moreover, it is his primordial personal matter, in which no human being has to interfere. What to say about your questions and attacks concerning Michael Hesemann? I think that attacks of any kind against him correspond to your personal opinion, which I cannot share with you. For my part, I have known Michael as a man of integrity, decency, righteousness, and truthfulness, and have worked with him for a long time, so I cannot accuse him of any unfairness. Michael Hesemann is a person who has not only dealt with UFOs, but is also very educated and is also a historian, author, documentary filmmaker and specialist journalist for contemporary and church history topics. Although Michael first became known in the late 1980s and early 1990s for his research and publications on UFOs and extraterrestrials, he turned to other fields of study in 1997 and has since been engaged in writing and publishing Christian-themed books as an author. But what about it, when Michael, whom I appreciate very much as a human being and also regarding his work and all the hostilities he took on for me, in his UFO books etc., names many alleged contact persons as
real
contact persons with aliens, then that is effectively his own business. The reason for this may be that he did not have the opportunity to get to know all the people concerned and to clarify with them in detail what was true and what was a lie or pure imagination. Perhaps he may also be, as you say, a little naive, whereby I mean that he may have been a little
naive
in his assessment of the so-called contactors according to your naive understanding. But whoever has somehow not done this himself in his life may throw the first stone at Michael Hesemann, but I think that no honest man on earth can throw a stone, because every single human being inevitably makes mistakes, misunderstands something or acts wrongly, whereby exactly such mistakes are undoubtedly made out of a certain naivety, which cannot be recognized as naivety, for naivety is not simply to be judged according to what the vernacular tends to call naivety, naive, childish, original, simple, harmless or foolish, etc., because the word naivety comes from the Latin term nativus, which was defined completely wrong as know-it-all and falsification of the term and means something completely different than just naivety, childlike, original, simple, harmless or foolish etc. The term naive, coming from the Latin
naivus,
means that a certain behavior of a human being is
born,
natural,
and therefore
native. Consequently, a
naivety
of man stands for the fact that he commits mistakes, is careless or religious, etc. But in any case this is connected with a natural innate evolutionary process, which normally consists in man learning from his naivety. So if a mistake is made, the consequence is that the cause of the error is sought, the error is corrected and from then on no longer committed. Similarly, the same principle applies to a belief that fundamentally corresponds to an error, misconception and misconduct and possibly wrongdoing, which must be thought about and the effective truth found. And also that is a thing that is innate in man, namely that he believes something or falls into a belief when he is inattentive and does not think everything over thoroughly and necessarily according to reality, and therefore does not find the truth. That which is generally called
naivety
thus corresponds to something completely different from what is actually meant, because this refers to the fact that a person behaves
unbiased, unclearly,
and that is what the terms
unbiased
and
neutral behavior
stand for. So it turns out that if Michael Hesemann has confronted any narratives, stories, facts, lies or slander in an unprejudiced and neutral manner, then he has simply reproduced what he has heard, what has been said or what he has seen, experienced and witnessed, and this has nothing to do with naivety in any way. Unfortunately, it has been the case since time immemorial that some
wise
and
cunning
contemporaries assess themselves incredibly cleverly and derive new terms, designations and words from any particular terms they do not understand correctly and introduce them into languages which are then completely wrong and mean something completely different from what must be understood by them. In this way, the whole thing is then handed down and used for centuries without anyone being disturbed by it or discovering the falseness of the term. But if one day, however, every client who understands certain words, terms and designations correctly and is therefore able to interpret and explain them correctly, appears to be able to explain what they actually mean effectively, then the enlightening ridiculousness is revealed by all know-it-alls in linguistics. And this has always been the case, because the
students and scholars with their doctoral and professorial degrees want or need to know everything better as
experts. As a consequence, it is almost impossible to correct and replace really completely wrong terms with effectively factual correct words, designations and concepts. But now what concerns all the alleged contact persons with just as alleged extraterrestrials as well as again alleged materials like earth, precious metals, crystals, potatoes and flights into world space or to other worlds, channeling with extraterrestrials and other nonsense. So I know through Plejaric clarifications and through my own experiences with such persons who tell such nonsense, that such lying and cheating earthlings of both sexes walk around the earth almost in masses, spread fantasy stories and deceive their believers. Who and how many of all those earthlings are conscious liars and cheats or jokers, phantoms or imaginary contactors as well as delusional people or those who want to arouse public interest, want to make themselves important, hope for a partnership, try to get a title or Nobel Prize or whatever, I don't know and don't want to judge, because that doesn't interest me at all. For me only reality and truth is of deep meaning and importance. But what I can now explain with certainty is that every female or male earthling is a liar and cheat if he or she claims to be in contact and connection with any person of the Plejars in personal or telepathic form, through channeling or otherwise.
10. There was a man in America called James Forrestal, etc.
Answer. And as far as the 10th question is concerned, there was a man in America named James Forrestal who knew something about UFOs, but then he killed himself, but I don't know why, so I want to know why. It has to be said that this man did not commit suicide, and I know this very well, because at that time the whole incident was observed by Sfath, for which he explained the whole circumstances to me and obliged me to keep silent in such a way that I never publicly mentioned the effective and true backgrounds and machinations of the far-reaching incidents, but only to that man who would then be the real one, who would take up my contacts with the Plejars and make them known worldwide, but then would persistently keep silent about all the special things I would entrust to him. Now the fact is that on the one hand the name of the man was not James Forrestal but James Vincent Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense of the United States, and he had such an extensive knowledge about UFOs and U.S. defense plans as well as about Secret Service operations etc., that a certain group and their forces etc., feared a great danger in it with regard to an exposure of their underhanded machinations. This was because Forrestal did not agree with these actions and was therefore a danger to the group, and his liquidation was therefore decided, which was then carried out by murdering him on the morning of May 22, 1949 at 1:47 a.m., first by strangling him unconscious in Bethesda Naval Hospital and then by throwing him out of a window on the 16th floor and smashing him to the ground.
12. Why do so many stupid people still believe the tall tales etc.?
Answer: the unknown, fantastic, inexplicable, novel and futuristic has always been the magnet for people, and it has remained so until today. This phenomenon will also remain so for a long time to come, because as long as people allow themselves to be seduced by indoctrination into a belief and believing bondage, as long as they do not think for themselves, do not decide for themselves, do not make their own truthful decisions without external influence, everything will remain as it has always been. If people continue to make no effort to create their own opinions and do not develop according to their own understanding and reason, if they do not acquire their own personal, righteous behavior, they will rot in their own stupidity, and this will remain as it has always been through both religious and any other faith. And this is so because every faith leads to blind bondage, far from any reality and truth, because every faith of any kind is built on lies and deceit, with religious faith as an almost hopeless delusion at the head of the front of all evil. But what now has to be said about Adamski himself can be explained briefly and concisely. Adamski was an unparalleled swindler, whom many followers of reason and reason thoughtlessly believed and still do so today, because they were unable to get to the bottom of reality and truth in their faith, which is in bondage to him. The fact is, I know Adamski personally from before, when he was in the Vauxhall Zurich in May 1959. I had not exactly got the best impression of him at that time, although I had to talk to him with an interpreter, because I was not yet able to speak English at that time. However, I noticed that the man was dominated by a tremendous stubbornness and by a great selfishness that seemed unusual to me, but which was to be covered up by an almost perfectly played friendliness and charity. I found that the man had an extraordinary gift for persuasion and suggestion and always knew how to take the conversation to himself. It was clearly evident that he had fallen for an ideal and was exploiting it to his own advantage by playing help for the oppressed. So it also seemed to me that fighting injustice was only an act by him, and everything just to put himself in the center. It seemed to me that in the first and last place for him only his own needs were always predominant, from the big toe up to the last tip of his hair. I had the impression at that time that he was in every respect only ever mindful of his own self and his own well-being, which he guided into the highest paths through an enormous imagination and suggestive power. He also seemed to me to be dominated by the will to be first in every respect and to want to take the lead in every respect. Furthermore, I can say today what I was unfortunately not allowed to say in public before for certain reasons, that Ascetic from the Daily Universe, on behalf of the Plejars faith, was my next contact person for a full 11 years from 1953, and then also until 1975. Ascot arranged that the two of us beamed into the room reserved for Adamski and suddenly stood before him. He collapsed from shock and could barely sit down on a chair. Ascetic talked to him and also translated everything I asked him and said that he was telling lies because he knew very well that his fantasy stories were nothing but fantasies. Slowly he recovered his composure and admitted his lying and cheating, formulating his motive in such a way that he had a great need for an acquaintance, as it is with actors. He had thought that he could use the story of Kenneth Arnold as a basis for this and expand it in the way he did. Our meeting with him, however, did not bring anything in the way that he would have stopped with his lies and cheating, because he continued to drive in the same style, because he was probably too cowardly to admit publicly his rotten machinations.
11. What is true about the Roswell UFO case? Etc.
Answer: the crash of a UFO was and is reality and had no relation to a weather balloon and Project Mogul. All military and scientific as well as Secret Service representations and claims that it was a weather balloon research company and that the crashed object was a balloon, are nothing more than a theater of lies and deception, which is supposed to cover up something that must not be allowed to reach the public for a long time. And I'm not allowed to talk about that either, so I have to keep it quiet.
14. Why, Billy Mia, are you keeping your distance from the public?
Answer: this question has already been answered by Michael Hesemann in point 2 of his letter to Professor Jim Dierdorf in the USA in the last century or millennium, whereby he has already answered your question and probably better than I could, which is why his answer is listed again below.
Anyone who has ever met Billy Meyer in person can confirm that his personality is neither that of a cult leader, nor that his position within FIGU is that of an authoritarian leader. KKK never met Billy, so he can't say anything about him. The structure of the FIGU is purely democratic. Each individual agenda item is voted on. A sect has a totalitarian ideology, faith, and you will find salvation. Billy teaches, do not believe, find the truth for yourself. In his philosophy, man can evolve only through self-knowledge. He does not appear in public. He does not want to become a public person, because he does not want people to follow him or to see him as something special. Instead, he wants people to learn and find the truth for themselves, because that is the only way they can grow and evolve. Michael Hesemann, 28, December 1998.
15. What's the Blue Book really about?
Answer: concerning the Blue Book mentioned above, it has to be said that it is the U.S. Legal Citation Manual, but there are also other Blue Books available, as can be seen for example in Wikipedia. Blue Books, books presented to the British Parliament on diplomatic negotiations. See Blue Book, England. The specification of the CD extra, hybrid CD with audio and data session. See Rainbow Books. Blue Book, Magazine, U.S. Magazine, 1905 1975. A paperback series founded in the USA in 1919. See Little Blue Books. Project Blue Book, a U.S. government project to study UFOs. Concerning the Blue Book inquired about, however, the following is to be said: that it is a Project Blue Book, namely a U.S. government project for the investigation of UFOs, to which I have found the following in Wikipedia, which in the end amounts to the fact that according to the alleged Blue Book clarifications in the matter of UFOs, such are not supposed to exist. Basically, these
clarifications
were nothing more than a well-thought-out deception by certain U.S. military, political and intelligence circles, and more, for the purpose of misleading the U.S. people. This, while also in the Soviet Union the UFO phenomenon was largely hushed up by the KGB etc. Although the UFOs also caused concern in government and KGB circles in the USSR, it is also a fact that during the Cold War between the USA and the USSR, these objects repeatedly evoked the danger of a further world war, partly even technically controlled by certain UFOs themselves, but then neutralized by them. But what is now being explained at Wikipedia in relation to the Project Blue Book, which was ultimately designed to deceive and mislead the American people, to mislead them about the effective truth of the UFO phenomenon and to leave them completely unaware of it through lies and deception. Is this the Project Blue Book was one of several systematic studies conducted by the U.S. Air Force Intelligence Agency to collect and evaluate sightings of UFOs by Air Force pilots, Air Force radar stations, other Air Force personnel, and field investigations. The study began in 1952 and was the third of its kind after Sign, 1947, and Grudge, 1949. The end of the project was ordered in December 1969 and all activities were stopped by the end of January 1970.
History. Project Sign, Project Grudge.
In 1947, the Project Sign was established and reported for most of 1948, and some of the staff, including Project Director Robert Snyder, preferred the extraterrestrial hypothesis as the best explanation for some UFO reports. High-ranking superiors then dissolved the project and the final report stated that while some UFOs corresponded to real aircraft, there was not enough data to determine their origin. In February 1949, Project Grudge followed and everything was evaluated under the premise that UFOs did not exist. Mockery spread throughout the Pentagon and many treated the issue as a ridiculous joke. The staff examined little or nothing, but at the same time explained the opposite. Some military personnel spread so much malice and ridicule that generals had to demand respect for the reports and their observers. The public was specifically disinformed with false reports. Pilots were portrayed as incompetent and hallucinatory and generals lied to each other. The final report of August 1949 cited as explanations for UFOs the misinterpretation of conventional objects, mass hysteria, lies of persons with a need for recognition and psychopathological persons.
Project Blue Book.
In 1951 the new Project Blue Book was founded under the direction of Edward J. Ruppelt. He tried to make the investigations more systematic and scientific. In particular, it promoted a standardization of the questionnaires used to contact staff who had made sightings. In 1954, the Project Blue Book presented the Project Blue Book, Special Report Number 14. Which contained sighting reports and tables. In total, about 3,200 sightings were documented by the Project Blue Book. The sightings were categorized as known, unknown and insufficient information, and the quality of the reports was rated on a scale of 1 to 4. About 69% of the cases were categorized as known, 9% lacked further information and 22% were rated as unknown. 33% of all excellent cases were unknown compared to only 17% of the worst cases. Cases were rated as excellent if they were observed particularly reliably, that is, for example by several trustworthy and experienced persons. Furthermore, the known and unknown sightings differed significantly in the observed characteristics. Despite these striking circumstances, the Air Force claimed that the report would confirm that none of the sightings could be linked to alien vehicles. Edward J. Ruppelt criticized this evaluation of the report in his book Report on Unidentified Flying Objects published in 1956. It considered that the report had been misused for political purposes without going into the substance. Project Blue Book's astronomical advisor was J. Allen Hynek, director of the Macmillan Observatory at Ohio State University. He also described the project from his point of view. New York 1972, The UFO Experience, A Scientific Inquiry, Munich 1978 UFO Report, a research report. In 1973 he founded QFOS, Center for UFO Studies,
Condon Committee and completion of Project Blue Book.
The Condon Committee was a commission of inquiry announced by the USAF as independent and objective under the leadership of Edward Condon of the University of Colorado. Until then, it was to evaluate all collected documents on UFO incidents. In 1969 the Project Blue Book was completed. After serious internal disagreements, the Condon Committee came to the conclusion, published in January 1969, that the UFO sightings were irrelevant to science and that further investigations were superfluous. This was the orientation of the USAF in its justification of the termination of Project Blue Book. The final report contains statistics on 12,618 reported incidents from 1947 to 1969. Most of which could be attributed to natural phenomena or conventional missiles. According to Condon, some reports were deliberate forgeries. 701 incidents, approximately 6%, were classified as unidentified. Criticism of Project Blue Book. David R. Saunders allegedly fell into the hands of a memo by the Commission's project manager, Robert Lowe, which was written shortly before the Commission began its work and which is said to have clearly set out the results the Commission would have had to show and how the public was to be deceived. After the public learned of this fact, Saunders was fired. No source. Another staff member wrote a detailed memo about blatant abuses at Condon and resigned her cooperation. Other UFO experts who had been invited to participate, such as Donald D. Kehoe, Nick Happ, also withdrew. Following the discontinuation of Blue Book in 1969, J. Allen Hynek published a book in 1972 entitled The UFO Experience, in which he gives facts and figures from his own point of view and, above all, reports on his experiences in Project Sign/Grudge/Blue Book. According to him, the USAF was constantly trying to deceive the public about the reality and extent of the UFO problem, and he himself was not uninvolved in this. However, Hynek concentrated mainly on the scientific side of the problem and strongly criticized the inadequacy of the equipment and the unscientific nature of Project Blue Book. In the meantime, however, more recent studies have been published on the American fascination with UFOs and the state's interest in them.
Documentation.
The files of the Project Blue Book are stored in the National Archive in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act and are open to the public. The microfilm archive can also be completely accessed and searched on the Internet. However, names of the eyewitnesses were deleted from the documents. The document also contains references to 2 investigations by the University of Colorado and a public statement, UFO Fact Sheet, which clarifies that in none of the cases investigated could any evidence of non-Irish vehicles be found.
16. What about those people who were abducted by aliens etc.?
Answer. Regarding the abduction of Earthlings by extraterrestrials, I have no exact knowledge, nor do I know people who have had such experiences and made corresponding experiences. But in addition, the Plejars explain that such events would probably have happened through the strangers who function around the Earth, but about which they would absolutely not care. Basically, such kidnapping machinations, if they actually take place, can be traced back to other intelligences, whereby the Plejars have nothing to do with such kidnappings. The Plejars themselves do not want to have anything to do with the strangers on Earth, as they call these other intelligences, Consequently, they protect themselves against any sight and location of the strangers, because they do not want to get into any contact with them, nor with Earthlings, under any circumstances. Concerning the
Men in Black
and
underwater UFO stations,
I am not allowed to give any information about them. UFO sightings have been recorded around the world since ancient times, whereby such observations are mostly effectively attributed to flying objects, which are due to the various groups of strangers staying on Earth. Elsewhere, many observations lead back to some earthly natural phenomena, which can be extremely diverse and which are also called UFO sightings. Furthermore, sightings can also be purely terrestrially manufactured futuristic flying objects, which are called UFOs because of their modern or unusually alien forms, simply as unknown flying objects. As far as Foo Fighters and interference of UFOs by strangers are concerned, which very often appear on Earth, intervene in acts of war or can trigger a danger of war or a giant catastrophe, I don't know anything about that. This is also not the case with regard to UFO events during the last World War from 1939 to 1945, as well as in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, etc. Everything is as strange as when people walking, driving in cars, trains, etc., or flying in airplanes are pursued by UFOs, chased in fear or abducted, etc. What sense is hidden behind all such machinations? I don't know, but the whole thing proves that there is neither peace nor humanity behind it.
All this, Edward, my friend, is well written, and I think it is right and justified to publish it. The fact that you are using the clarifications of Guido Moosbrugger for this purpose, although you vehemently refused to do so in 2006, it is probably right to do so now, also together with the statements of Michael Hesemann.
Exactly. I thought the whole thing through and thought that I would publish his statement after all, after I had received the letter from Mr.
I would like to take this letter as an original and archive it with us. You could make a copy for yourself.
You can have it, but I don't need a copy, because I have copied everything.
I think it's good that you're going back to all the suffering of the earlier years in this way, but I think it will be good, but it won't be completely accepted if it's not thoroughly thought about. You yourself abstain from any answer and therefore also from any attack and justification, which is very good. And I abstain from mentioning the name of the person I am now talking about. Besides, you do not need them anyway, because all the accusations made against you are not true at all, but are contrary to malicious and irresponsible insults, which are pathologically caused. What I consider particularly serious is the fact that the hate behavior against you was created very early on, for which I have not been able to find any justification to this day, even though I have dealt with this issue time and again. The fact is, however, that the unjust and defamatory behavior against you is entirely based on a pathological malignancy, the origin of which, however, cannot be found. What I am explaining now corresponds to my medical and psychological as well as psychiatric education, namely with regard to my findings since 1975 until today, because I am still dealing with them. Also, everything corresponds to what I have recognized and diagnosed in the person concerned during the same period. The diagnosis shows clearly and unambiguously that this person is affected by abnormal pathological processes and conditions caused by consciousness, but as I have already explained, I have not yet been able to fathom their causes, which, however, are the subject of my ongoing research. The phenomenon itself as well as the symptoms of the pathological behavior point to a specific feature that shows a malformation of the nature of the being, which corresponds to a predisposition of the entire character traits and thus to a pathologically damaged personality and individuality structure. As a result, the very person to whom this abnormality is attached and who is psychologically evaluated by me is not only emotionally immature, but this immaturity is also related to their personality. From a psychiatric point of view, this results in a conspicuous behavior of a selfish delusional behavior, as well as an insufficient insight and perception of a real experience of reality. This leads to a confusing confusion of thoughts, which results in a lack of experience and an illusion of perception of the real reality. The experience and the experiences resulting from it are strongly influenced by self-deception as well as by acoustic and visual deceptions of perception, whereby she is dominated by her uncontrollably changing emotional impulses, which have always prevented her normal development throughout her life. Therefore, also during her life there were unrealistic behaviors that will continue to exist, so that it will remain so for her, and she will remain dominated by her inner and outer causes and conditions. This phenomenon develops strong confusing influences on the psyche and brings with it that the discrimination ability of the person concerned is also disturbed temporarily or completely in such a way that reality and unreality can no longer be distinguished from each other. This is then expressed by delusions which cause such disturbances in the perception of reality that the delusional structure manifests itself in the consciousness of the person as truth and reality. From this a pathological self-deception and a self-constrained love as well as false self-conviction are formed, which lead to an excessively high self-esteem and self-aggrandizement, but ultimately to an abnormal pathological delusion of a truthful reality and truthfulness of the all-dominant delusions.
If I understand your remarks correctly, then you mean that a person who is afflicted with pathological delusions or delusions takes them as reality and truth and believes that it is really so. Thereby, if I understand everything correctly, it does not matter if the delusion corresponds to a phantasmagoria risp, an assembly, just a perception illusion, which manifests itself as illusion, imagination risp, conceit or fake image, dream image, wishful dream, as a head birth, vision, deception or as fantasy, effective delusion, other unreality and unreality or possibly proves to be effective truth.
That is the meaning of my explanation. But now, Edward, I must end our conversation for today.
That's true, but unfortunately it's not always possible to calculate the time in advance when a topic is raised that needs to be discussed in detail. But now I would like to ask you what you think of my idea, which is that I want to ask someone if anyone from our old guard has a few words to say about the smear article in the Sfath interview, which I could then add to this interview.
Of course you can do that, because it might be good if another member, who was there from the beginning, would contribute a short correction to what Guido also wrote about 13 years ago.
I thought that maybe Bernadette would be the right person for that, because besides Jacobus, who was there from the beginning and who, as a scribbler, declares himself to be a zero, only Bernadette is present today, because everyone else has died, except Olgi, although she is already over 93 years old, can hardly walk anymore and also can't deal well with writing. They are still alive, but it would be a disgraceful imposition to have to deal with these two drifters.
I think so, too, which is why Bernadette is the only choice, although she is also the right person for a proper brief presentation of the facts.